The wind howls through ancient pines as a Norse trading party moves cautiously along a frozen river. 20 men, armed with axes and spears, their breath crystallising in the frigid air. They've come north for furs, for ivory, for the treasures that only these lands can provide. The leader scans the tree line, unease prickling at his neck. The forest stands silent, too silent. The first arrow strikes without warning, a whispered death from the white void. Before the Norsemen can form a shield wall, missiles rain from multiple directions. Confusion erupts as they wheel about, seeking enemies visible only as fleeting shadows among the trees. Figures on what appear to be wooden foot extensions glide effortlessly across the snow, firing with deadly precision before vanishing into the white. The Norse warriors, formidable on the open field and feared throughout Europe, find themselves helpless. Their heavy boots sink deep into snow, while their attackers move like winter spirits across its surface. When the Norsemen retreat to the frozen river, more arrows greet them from the opposite bank. By nightfall, only 3 survivors huddle in the darkness, wounds freezing in the bitter cold. They strain to hear movement beyond their small fire, knowing that morning will bring no mercy. In these northern realms there are no ransoms, no thralls taken, no quarter given. Who fought like this? And why did surrender mean nothing? The northern frontiers of the Viking world weren't conquered by the feared Norse warriors. They were where Norse dominance ended. While dragon-prowed longships brought terror to coastlines from Ireland to Constantinople, there remained peoples who not only resisted Viking expansion, but inspired fear among the Northmen themselves. The historical record, though fragmented, reveals a striking pattern. Norse expeditions into the far northern forests and tundra often ended in disaster when confronting indigenous resistance. This is the story of how the forest peoples of the far north, primarily those called Finns in Norse sources, and the more enigmatic Bjarmians, developed combat tactics that neutralised Viking advantages and turned the frozen landscape itself into a weapon. It's a tale largely absent from popular accounts of the Viking Age, yet crucial to understanding the true boundaries of Norse power and the sophisticated military adaptations of peoples often dismissed as primitive. The written evidence comes primarily from the Norse perspective, in sagas, chronicles, and accounts like that of Othere, a Norwegian merchant who described these northern peoples to King Alfred of Wessex around 890 CE. Archaeological findings help fill gaps in the written record, revealing trade networks, settlement patterns, and material culture that support and sometimes challenge textual claims. What emerges is a fascinating study in asymmetric warfare, environmental mastery, and cultural adaptation. The forest fighters of the north developed tactics specifically calibrated to neutralise Norse military advantages. Where Vikings excelled in shield wall formations and naval landings, the northern peoples excelled in forest ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and winter warfare that left Norse parties disoriented, immobilised, and vulnerable. The stakes were high on both sides. For the Norse, the northern territories represented crucial access to valuable trade goods, particularly furs and walrus ivory, that fueled their broader economic networks. For the indigenous peoples, these incursions threatened autonomy, resources, and survival itself. The resulting conflicts shaped the northern frontier for centuries. Most intriguing is how environmental mastery translated into tactical advantage. The northern fighters weren't simply defending territory, they were leveraging intimate knowledge of one of Earth's most challenging environments as a force multiplier. Their ability to move rapidly over snow, navigate dense forests, and survive extreme cold transformed these capabilities into combat advantages that even hardened Norse warriors struggled to counter. The question that drives our exploration is deceptively simple. How did these forest peoples develop combat systems effective enough to make Vikings, the most feared warriors of their age, hesitate before venturing into their territories? The answer lies at the intersection of environment, technology, cultural knowledge, and tactical innovation. To understand this forgotten chapter of resistance, we must first clarify who these northern adversaries actually were, a task complicated by the terminology used in our sources and centuries of ethnographic confusion. When Norse sources speak of Finnar, often translated as Finns in English, they're typically not referring to the ancestors of modern Finns from what is now Finland. Rather, they're describing what we would today call the Sami people, an indigenous group whose traditional territories spanned northern Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia's Kola Peninsula. This terminological confusion has persisted for centuries, with Finn in medieval Norse sources almost always referring to Sami people. The Sami themselves represent a distinct cultural and linguistic group whose presence in northern Scandinavia dates back thousands of years. Archaeological evidence suggests continuous habitation of their traditional territories since the retreat of the ice sheets after the last glacial period. They developed sophisticated adaptations to northern environments, including specialised hunting techniques, semi-nomadic herding practices, and technologies perfectly suited to Arctic and subarctic conditions. It's crucial to understand that the Sami weren't a monolithic group, but rather comprised diverse communities with regional variations in livelihood, dialect and custom. Some were primarily reindeer herders, others specialised in fishing, while still others focused on hunting or combinations of these activities. This diversity influenced how different Sami groups interacted with Norse settlers and traders. More mysterious in the historical record are the Bjarmians, Bjarmar in Old Norse sources. These people inhabited territories around the White Sea in what is now northwestern Russia. Some scholars associate them with Permian peoples who spoke Finno-Ugric languages related to modern Komi or Udmurt. The Bjarmians appear in several saga accounts, notably in connection with Norse expeditions to the White Sea region, where they are described as having established settlements, trading posts, and even religious centres. The relationship between these groups, Sami and Bjarmians, remains somewhat unclear in historical sources. They likely shared some cultural and perhaps linguistic features, but represented distinct peoples with their own territories, traditions, and political organisations. What they did share was expertise in northern environments that translated into tactical advantages when facing Norse incursions. Other groups also inhabited these northern regions, including what Norse sources sometimes call Karelians, Kirjala, and various other peoples of what is now northern Russia. The ethnic and cultural landscape was complex, with overlapping territories, trade relationships, and occasional conflicts between these different groups. When examining primary sources, we must remain aware of the limitations and biases in Norse accounts. The sagas and chronicles were written primarily by Christians, often centuries after the events they describe, and frequently characterise northern peoples through a lens of the exotic or supernatural. Others' account of King Alfred provides somewhat more reliable first-hand observations, but still reflects the perspective of an outsider viewing these cultures through his own cultural framework. Archaeological evidence helps balance these written accounts, revealing sophisticated material cultures, extensive trade networks, and technological innovations among northern peoples that believe any simplistic characterization as primitive. Burial sites, settlement remains, and recovered artifacts demonstrate complex societies with specialized crafts, spiritual traditions, and social stratification. The language situation further complicates our understanding. The Sami languages belong to the Finno-Ugric family, entirely unrelated to the North Germanic languages spoken by Norse peoples. This linguistic divide would have created significant communication challenges, likely requiring intermediaries and translators for any complex interactions. Such barriers often contribute to misunderstanding and conflict, particularly when combined with competition for resources. What emerges from careful analysis of available evidence is a picture of sophisticated northern peoples with deep knowledge of their environments, complex social structures, and the capacity to adapt and respond to external threats, including those posed by Norse expansion. Their resistance wasn't merely reactive, but demonstrated strategic thinking and tactical innovation that would shape the northern frontier throughout the Viking Age and beyond. To understand the combat dynamics between Norse raiders and northern forest peoples, we must first comprehend the environment where these encounters took place. The northern frontier wasn't simply colder than the southern Scandinavia. It represented an entirely different ecological and tactical landscape that fundamentally altered how conflict unfolded. The dominant environment was the taiga, or boreal forest, a vast belt of coniferous woodland stretching across northern Eurasia. Unlike the mixed forests and open fields of southern Scandinavia, the taiga presents dense stands of pine, spruce and birch, often growing so closely together that visibility is limited to mere dozens of paces. This forest environment immediately negated one of the Norse warriors' primary advantages: formation fighting. Vikings excelled in shield wall tactics that required open ground and coordinated movement. In the close confines of the taiga, such formations became impossible to maintain. Warriors could easily lose sight of companions just 20 steps away, making coordinated action extremely difficult. The forest itself broke up units, scattered formations, and created conditions of isolation, even for groups travelling together. The seasonal transformation of this landscape added another layer of complexity. During winter months, which could last from October to May in the far north, snow cover completely altered movement dynamics. Those without proper equipment would sink knee-deep or deeper with each step, while those with appropriate technology, like skis or snowshoes, could move rapidly across the surface. This mobility differential proved decisive in countless encounters. River systems formed the primary transportation networks through this challenging terrain. The major waterways, including the northern Dvina, Onega, and Mesen rivers flowing to the White Sea, and the countless rivers of northern Scandinavia, served as highways in summer and frozen corridors in winter. These rivers connected the resource-rich interior with coastal trading centres, making them both vital economic arteries and strategic control points. The climate itself became a tactical factor. Winter temperatures regularly plunged below -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, creating conditions where exposure for even short periods could result in frostbite or hypothermia. Summer brought its own challenges. Swarms of mosquitoes and biting flies could torment unprotected travellers, and the brief thaw turned parts of the landscape into nearly impassable bogs. Those intimately familiar with these seasonal rhythms could predict and exploit these conditions. Those without such knowledge often suffered severely. Sound behaved differently in this environment as well. Snow dampened noise, allowing skilled forest dwellers to move with surprising stealth. In dense forest, sound could play tricks. A voice might carry clearly in one direction, but be inaudible just a short distance away in another. These acoustic properties created opportunities for ambush and misdirection that northern fighters exploited to great effect. The forest also offered abundant natural materials for improvised defences and obstacles. Fallen trees, snow barriers, and deliberately weakened ice could channel enemies into killing zones or slow their progress to the point of exhaustion. The landscape itself became an extension of northern tactical systems, not merely the setting for combat, but an active element in it. For Norse raiders accustomed to coastal operations with their ships as floating bases, the deep forest represented a profoundly alien environment. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated. Warriors who might stand firm against charging enemies on open ground could find themselves unnerved by the oppressive closeness of the forest, the limited visibility, and the constant sense of being watched from concealment. Seasonal timing dictated the nature of encounters. Summer expeditions faced different challenges than winter ones, with each season offering distinct advantages to the defenders. Summer brought relative ease of river travel, but difficult overland movement through boggy terrain and dense undergrowth. Winter offered the possibility of overland travel on frozen waterways and snow-covered ground, but at the cost of extreme cold and the need for specialised equipment and knowledge. This environmental context is essential for understanding how northern peoples could effectively resist Norse military power. Their combat systems weren't developed in a vacuum, but evolved specifically to exploit the advantages their homeland offered, while neutralising the strengths of potential invaders. The forest wasn't simply where they fought, it was how they fought. Given the harsh conditions and remote location, why did Norse leaders repeatedly risk expeditions into these dangerous northern territories? The answer lies in the extraordinary economic value of northern resources within the broader Viking Age trade networks. The North offered treasures found nowhere else, commodities so valuable they justified the substantial risks of acquiring them. Chief among these prizes were furs. The northern forests produced pelts of exceptional quality, sable, marten, fox, beaver and others, that commanded astronomical prices in European and Middle Eastern markets. A single sable pelt could be worth more than a skilled craftsman might earn in months. The finest furs served as status symbols for elites across the medieval world, from Baghdad to Paris. The demand seemed inexhaustible, creating powerful incentives for Norse traders and raiders to secure access to these northern treasures. Walrus ivory represented another extraordinarily valuable northern commodity. With elephant ivory difficult to obtain in medieval Europe, walrus tusks provided a crucial alternative for luxury goods production. Craftsmen transformed this material into everything from religious artifacts to gaming pieces for wealthy patrons. The Norse sources specifically mention Bjarmian territories as sources for this precious material, suggesting established hunting or trading operations in the White Sea region. Hunting birds, particularly gerfalcons, constituted another luxury export. These magnificent Arctic falcons were prized by royal courts throughout Europe and the Islamic world for hunting and as prestigious gifts. A single white gerfalcon could be worth the equivalent of several high-quality horses, a princely sum. Norse traders who could secure these birds stood to make enormous profits in southern markets. Other valuable commodities included whalebone, amber, fish oil, and even human captives taken as slaves. Together, these northern resources integrated into broader trade networks that connected Scandinavia with the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, and Western Europe. Archaeological discoveries throughout these regions confirm the widespread distribution of northern goods, demonstrating their importance in medieval commerce. The economics of this northern trade created strong incentives for Norse chieftains and kings. Control over northern resources could transform a minor leader into a wealthy and influential figure. The sagas contain numerous accounts of individuals who made their fortunes through northern expeditions, using the resulting wealth to build political power in their home regions. This economic reality ensured continued Norse interest, despite the dangers involved. For the indigenous peoples of the north, these same resources represented their livelihood and survival. Furs, ivory and other goods weren't simply trade commodities, but essential elements of their economic systems. They harvested these materials sustainably over generations, developing specialised techniques for hunting, processing, and preserving these valuable resources. Archaeological evidence from trading centres like Staraya Ladoga, Birka, and Hedeby reveals the scale of this commerce. Northern goods appear consistently in the archaeological record, often alongside Arabic coins, Byzantine artefacts, and other evidence of long-distance trade. Analysis of these findings confirms that northern resources weren't peripheral to Viking Age economics, but central to them. The Norse themselves recognised the value of establishing more systematic access to these resources rather than relying solely on raiding. There's account to King Alfred describes his voyages along the northern coast, where he engaged in trade with local peoples and collected tribute. This combination of trade, tribute, and occasional raiding characterised Norse approaches to securing northern wealth. Climate also played a role in the economic equation. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 CE, may have temporarily improved conditions for northern travel, potentially opening new territories for exploitation. Conversely, harsh winters could cut off access entirely, creating boom and bust cycles in the availability of northern goods that further drove up their value. This economic context explains why, despite the considerable dangers, Norse leaders continued to organise expeditions northward. The potential rewards simply outweighed the risks, at least in the calculations of those who launched such ventures. For every expedition that ended in disaster, others returned with wealth that transformed their leaders' fortunes and status. The intersection of this economic imperative with indigenous resistance created the conditions for conflict. As Norse interests in northern resources intensified, so too did their efforts to systematise extraction through tribute systems, a development that would generate increasing friction with northern peoples. The evolution from occasional trade to systematic tribute collection marks a crucial transition in Norse-northern relations. What began as sporadic commercial interactions gradually transformed into more coercive systems of resource extraction, creating the conditions for sustained conflict. This shift is documented in both written sources and archaeological evidence, revealing how economic exploitation became increasingly institutionalised. Ode's late 9th century account to King Alfred describes how each pays according to his rank, and mentions that tribute included animal skins, bird feathers, whalebone, and ship ropes made from walrus hide or seal skin. This early description already suggests a formalised system, rather than purely voluntary exchange. By the 11th century, Norse sources describe more explicitly coercive tribute collection from northern peoples, with armed expeditions specifically organised for this purpose. The most notorious of these tribute expeditions appears in accounts of Tore Hund's journey to Bjarmland, around 1026 CE. According to saga sources, Tore led an armed party that engaged in both trade and plunder, culminating in the raiding of burial mounds believed to contain valuable goods. This expedition ended in violent conflict with the Bjarmians, establishing a pattern that would be repeated in numerous later encounters. The mechanics of tribute collection followed seasonal patterns. Winter, despite its harsh conditions, often proved the optimal time for collection expeditions. Frozen rivers provided access to interior settlements, and northern peoples would have gathered their harvest of furs and other goods. Norse collectors typically travelled in armed groups, moving from settlement to gather the required payments. For northern communities, these tribute demands created difficult choices. Payment meant surrendering resources crucial for their own trade and subsistence. Resistance meant risking violent reprisal. Many communities likely calculated that periodic tribute payment represented the lesser evil, particularly when collectors arrived in force. Others chose resistance, either through evasion, simply disappearing into the forest before collectors arrived, or through direct confrontation. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of increasing economic pressure. Settlement patterns in some northern areas show temporary abandonment, coinciding with periods of intensified Norse activity, suggesting tactical withdrawal as a resistance strategy. Other sites show evidence of fortification or concealment, indicating communities preparing for potential conflict. The tribute system created inherent instability. Norse collectors had incentives to demand ever-increasing payments, while northern communities had every reason to minimise or avoid these extractions. When collectors encountered resistance or found less than they expected, the situation could quickly escalate from taxation to raiding. The line between tribute collection and outright plunder often blurred, particularly when collectors faced shortfalls that would disappoint their leaders back home. Primary sources describe how some Norse collectors resorted to hostage-taking to ensure compliance, seizing community members who would be released only when tribute requirements were met. This practice naturally generated intense resentment and often provoked violent resistance once the immediate threat had passed. The seasonal nature of collection created cycles of presence and absence that northern peoples could exploit. During the intervals between Norse expeditions, communities could prepare defences, establish warning systems, or relocate valuable goods to hidden caches. Some archaeological sites reveal evidence of such preparations, including concealed storage areas and lookout positions commanding views of approach routes. Not all interactions were adversarial. Some Norse traders established more cooperative relationships with northern communities, preferring regular peaceful exchange to coercive collection. These relationships sometimes lasted generations, creating zones of relative stability amid broader patterns of conflict. Archaeological evidence from trading sites shows evidence of both Norse and Northern goods, suggesting ongoing exchange rather than one-sided extraction. The tribute system also generated competition among Norse leaders for control of collection rights. Kings increasingly claimed authority over northern territories, granting collection privileges to favoured followers or using tribute expeditions to extend royal power into frontier regions. This political dimension added another layer of complexity to northern interactions. For northern peoples, the pressure of tribute demands likely strengthened internal cohesion and accelerated tactical innovation. Communities facing external threats typically develop more coordinated defensive systems and leadership structures. The very pressure intended to extract resources instead generated more effective resistance, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that would shape the northern frontier for centuries. The economic foundation of conflict helps explain why these encounters became increasingly systematized on both sides. What began as opportunistic raiding evolved into organized tribute collection from the Norse perspective, while northern responses developed from ad hoc resistance into sophisticated defensive systems designed specifically to counter Norse expeditions. Beyond the material realities of northern conflict lay psychological and spiritual dimensions that profoundly influenced how both sides approached these encounters. The Norse and northern peoples brought fundamentally different worldviews to their interactions, creating misunderstandings that often escalated violence and generated lasting mythologies about the nature of their adversaries. Norse sources frequently attribute supernatural powers to northern peoples, particularly the Sami. Sagas describe them as skilled in magic, Seda, capable of controlling weather, shape-changing and casting curses. These accounts reflect the Norse tendency to interpret unfamiliar skills through a supernatural lens. What were actually sophisticated environmental adaptations, the ability to predict weather patterns, move silently through forests, or track game across seemingly featureless terrain, appeared magical to outside observers lacking such knowledge. This perception created both fear and fascination among the Norse. Some sought to harness northern magic through alliance or marriage with northern peoples. Others approached northern territories with trepidation, believing themselves vulnerable to supernatural attack. This psychological dimension added another advantage for northern fighters, who faced enemies already primed to interpret normal occurrences as evidence of sorcery. From the northern perspective, the spiritual landscape was inseparable from the physical environment. Sacred sites, ancestral territories, and ritual practices were embedded in the land itself. Norse incursions threatened not just material resources, but spiritual integrity. This religious dimension likely intensified resistance and eliminated any middle ground in certain conflicts, particularly when sacred sites were violated. The infamous raid by Tore Hund on Bjarmian burial grounds around 1026 CE exemplifies this dynamic. According to saga accounts, Tore's party plundered grave goods from mounds containing the dead, a profound spiritual violation that provoked immediate and violent response from the Bjarmians. What might have been a routine tribute collection escalated into a life-or-death conflict precisely because it crossed spiritual boundaries. Shamanic traditions among northern peoples, particularly the Sami, likely influenced combat psychology as well. Shamanic practitioners served as spiritual leaders who could interpret omens, provide ritual protection, and advise on appropriate actions in conflict situations. Archaeological evidence, including ritual drums, goavdis, and sacred sites, confirms the importance of these spiritual dimensions in northern cultures. The Norse themselves weren't immune to spiritual influences on combat. Many believed in concepts like battle luck, hamingja, that could determine outcomes regardless of material advantages. When facing opponents with fearsome reputations for magical abilities, even hardened warriors might experience doubt that undermined their effectiveness. Primary sources describe Norse fighters becoming sword-struck, a psychological state where weapons seem to lose their power when facing supposedly magical opponents. Environmental factors amplified these psychological elements. The disorientation of dense forests, the eerie acoustics of winter landscapes, and the physical stress of extreme cold could trigger perceptual distortions that reinforced supernatural interpretations. When exhausted, cold, and lost, even rational minds become susceptible to seeing patterns and threats that might not exist. A phenomenon northern fighters likely understood and exploited. Language barriers prevented clear communication that might have diffused tensions or clarified misunderstandings. Without shared language, intentions were interpreted through actions alone, creating ample room for escalation based on misread signals. What one side might view as a warning could be interpreted as an attack by the other, triggering violent responses that spiraled beyond initial intentions. The no prisoners reputation of northern fighters created its own psychological dynamic. Norse warriors accustomed to the possibility of ransom or enslavement if defeated now faced opponents who offered no such options. This knowledge likely affected combat psychology on both sides, making Norse fighters more desperate when cornered while reinforcing northern fighters' commitment to total victory. Cultural differences in the concept of territorial control also generated conflict. Norse systems increasingly emphasised formal authority over defined territories, while many northern peoples operated with more fluid concepts of land use, rights and seasonal movement. These different frameworks created fundamental misunderstandings about who controlled what and under what circumstances resources could be harvested. Over generations, these encounters generated cultural memory on both sides that shaped future interactions. Northern oral traditions preserved strategies that had proven effective, while Norse accounts emphasised the dangers of northern expeditions. These accumulated experiences created a psychological landscape as real and influential as the physical terrain where these conflicts unfolded. Understanding these belief systems and psychological factors helps explain why northern resistance proved so effective beyond purely tactical considerations. The northern peoples fought not just for material resources, but for spiritual integrity and cultural survival, creating a determination that translated into fierce resistance against even overwhelming odds. The tactical advantage of northern forest peoples wasn't simply about knowing the terrain. It was about transforming the forest itself into an active element of their combat system. Unlike the open fields where Norse warriors typically excelled, the taiga created conditions that systematically negated Viking strengths while amplifying indigenous capabilities. Consider the fundamental problem of visibility. In dense pine and spruce stands, sightlines rarely extend beyond 40 paces. This limited visibility immediately fragmented Norse parties, who typically relied on maintaining visual contact to coordinate movements. Archaeological experiments with period clothing and equipment suggest that a warrior in Norse gear would struggle to see companions even 20 steps away among close-set trees, especially in low light or precipitation. This visual limitation made standard Viking combat formations impossible to maintain. The shield wall, backbone of Norse tactical doctrine, required shoulder-to-shoulder positioning and coordinated movement. In forest conditions, such formations became not just difficult, but actively dangerous, as gaps would inevitably appear, creating vulnerable points that defenders could exploit. Primary sources describe Norse parties becoming scattered like leaves when attempting to move through dense woodland in combat conditions. The acoustic properties of the forest created another tactical dimension. Sound behaves unpredictably among trees, especially in winter conditions. A branch breaking might carry clearly for hundreds of paces in one direction, while remaining inaudible just 50 paces away in another. Northern fighters intimately understood these acoustic patterns and exploited them to communicate with allies while confusing enemies. There's account mentions the disorienting effect of voices that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere, suggesting deliberate acoustic deception tactics. Seasonality transformed the battlefield in ways that northern defenders anticipated and exploited. Winter conditions covered the ground with snow of varying depths, concealing deadfalls, streams and other hazards invisible to those without local knowledge. Spring thaws created muddy conditions that could immobilize heavily equipped fighters. Summer brought dense undergrowth that further restricted movement, while providing additional concealment for defenders. Each season presented different challenges that required specialized knowledge to navigate safely. The three-dimensional nature of forest combat represented another departure from Norse experience. While Vikings certainly understood the value of high ground in open field battles, forest fighting required awareness not just of what lay ahead, but what lay above. Northern fighters frequently used elevated positions, in trees, on ridgelines or atop rock formations, to observe movement and launch attacks while remaining virtually invisible from below. Archaeological surveys of conflict sites have identified probable observation posts commanding views of approach routes, often with evidence of repeated use over generations. Temperature gradients within the forest created further tactical opportunities. Dense stands create noticeably different microclimates than clearings or waterways, with temperature variations that can affect visibility through condensation or frost patterns. Northern fighters used these environmental cues to predict conditions and position themselves advantageously, while Norse parties often misinterpreted or missed these subtle indicators entirely. The forest also provided abundant materials for improvised obstacles and barriers. Fallen trees, brush piles, and snow walls could channel movement along predictable paths, creating natural ambush points. Archaeological evidence from several sites suggests deliberate modification of forest approaches to settlements, with arrangements of obstacles that appear random but actually direct movement toward prepared defensive positions. Water features within forests added another tactical layer. Small streams, bogs, and frozen lakes each presented different challenges and opportunities. Norse accounts describe the terror of pursuing enemies across what appeared to be solid ground, only to plunge through thin ice or sink into concealed bogs. The distribution of weight, a critical factor when crossing uncertain terrain, favoured lighter fighters with specialised equipment over heavily armed Norse warriors. The forest's impact on weapons effectiveness cannot be overstated. The Norse axe and sword, devastating in open combat, became unwieldy in close forest conditions where branches restricted swing arcs. Conversely, shorter stabbing weapons and projectiles suffered fewer limitations. Northern fighters adapted their armaments accordingly, favouring weapons specifically suited to forest engagement, a tactical choice reflected in both archaeological findings and saga descriptions. Fire behaviour in forest environments created both hazards and opportunities that northern defenders understood intimately. Controlled burning could be used to direct movement, create smoke screens, or signal across distances. Several saga accounts mention northern fighters using smoke to confuse or corral Norse parties, suggesting sophisticated understanding of how fire and smoke behave in different forest conditions. Perhaps most significantly, the forest environment magnified the advantage of local knowledge to an extraordinary degree. In open terrain, unfamiliar features might be visible from a distance, allowing for adaptation. In dense forest, hazards often remain invisible until encountered directly, a dynamic that heavily favoured defenders with generational knowledge of every ridge, ravine and waterway. This knowledge gap created a multiplier effect that allowed numerically inferior forces to effectively counter larger, better equipped opponents. The psychological impact of forest combat on Norse warriors appears repeatedly in primary sources. Saga accounts describe experienced fighters becoming disoriented, separated from companions, and overwhelmed by the sense of being watched from all sides. This psychological pressure could transform even minor engagements into routs as panic spread through Norse parties, unaccustomed to fighting, without clear sightlines and solid footing. For northern defenders, the forest wasn't merely terrain to be traversed, but an active ally in their defensive system. Their combat methods evolved specifically to exploit these environmental characteristics, creating an integrated approach that leveraged every aspect of the landscape against those who lacked the specialised knowledge to counter it. The decisive advantage in northern warfare often came down to a single factor: mobility. The ability to move quickly and efficiently through challenging terrain, particularly snow-covered ground, created tactical possibilities that transformed combat dynamics. Northern peoples developed specialised technologies and techniques that allowed them to maintain this mobility advantage against Norse adversaries. The most iconic of these technologies was the ski. Archaeological evidence confirms that ski technology was already highly developed in northern Scandinavia by the Viking Age, with specimens dating back thousands of years. These weren't primitive implements, but sophisticated tools precisely adapted to different snow conditions and purposes. Fragments recovered from bogs and permafrost reveal construction techniques using specific wood types, with pine or spruce for the body and birch for binding attachments. Ski design varied regionally and functionally. Some were broad and short for manoeuvrability in forests, while others were longer for speed across open terrain. Many featured animal skin coverings on the bottom surface, typically reindeer or seal, with the hairs arranged to grip when climbing but glide when descending. This natural waxing system allowed skilled users to move efficiently across varied terrain without stopping to adjust equipment. The tactical advantage provided by skis cannot be overstated. A skilled skier could maintain speeds of 5 to 7 kilometers per hour over long distances in conditions where a person on foot might struggle to cover 1 kilometre in the same time. Primary sources describe northern fighters appearing to fly across the snow like birds, highlighting the supernatural quality this mobility seemed to possess in Norse eyes. Complementing skis were snowshoes, which offered different advantages in certain conditions. While slower than skis, snowshoes provided superior manoeuvrability in dense forest and better stability when fighting. Archaeological evidence suggests regional preferences, with some northern groups favouring ski technology, while others relied more heavily on snowshoes. Many fighters likely carried both, switching between them as conditions demanded. The construction of these mobility tools required intimate knowledge of materials and conditions. Effective snowshoes needed precisely the right balance of surface area and weight, with bindings that would secure the foot without restricting blood flow in extreme cold. This specialised knowledge represented generations of refinement and adaptation to specific regional conditions. Sleds and pulks, toboggan-like pulling sleds, formed another crucial element of northern mobility systems. These allowed fighters to transport supplies, equipment, and, if necessary, wounded comrades across snow-covered terrain. The design of these conveyances balanced weight, durability, and ease of repair in field conditions. Some archaeological specimens show ingenious features, like runners with bone or antler inserts at contact points to reduce friction on different snow types. River ice provided critical mobility corridors in winter, but brought its own dangers that northern peoples understood far better than their Norse adversaries. Ice thickness, quality, and safety varied with current speed, underwater springs, and insulating snow cover. Factors invisible to the untrained eye, but readily apparent to those with generational knowledge. Saga accounts describe northern fighters confidently crossing ice that subsequently broke under pursuing Norse warriors, suggesting deliberate exploitation of marginal ice conditions. Snow itself provided information that northern fighters could read like text. Different types of snow, powder, crust, wet, granular, each preserved tracks differently and created distinct movement possibilities. The ability to judge snow conditions at a glance allowed northern fighters to predict enemy movement patterns and position themselves accordingly. Some accounts describe northern scouts identifying the exact composition of Norse parties. How many men, whether they carried heavy equipment, even if any were wounded, solely from examining tracks in snow. The logistical implications of these mobility advantages extended beyond combat to fundamentally shape campaign parameters. Northern fighters could cover distances in winter that would exhaust Norse parties, allowing them to choose engagement locations and control the tempo of conflicts. They could also more easily withdraw when necessary, secure in the knowledge that pursuers would struggle to maintain pace in unfamiliar terrain. Animal transportation, particularly reindeer, occasionally supplemented human mobility in northern operations. While not typically used in direct combat, reindeer could transport supplies to forward positions or rapidly relocate communities threatened by Norse incursions. The relationship between northern peoples and these animals represented another specialised knowledge domain that provided indirect but significant tactical advantages. Equipment design reflected the priority placed on mobility. Northern fighters typically carried lighter, more specialised gear than their Norse counterparts. Their clothing, usually layered wool and furs with sophisticated ventilation systems to prevent overheating during exertion, allowed freedom of movement while providing effective insulation. Weapons and tools were selected for weight efficiency and multiple uses, minimising the burden carried while maximising capability in field conditions. The psychological impact of this mobility differential appears repeatedly in Norse accounts. The frustration of pursuing an enemy who seemed to effortlessly glide away, only to reappear unexpectedly from another direction, created a sense of helplessness that undermined morale. Even experienced Norse commanders struggled to counter this fundamental advantage, as it negated their usual tactical approaches and forced them to fight on unfamiliar terms. Perhaps most importantly, northern mobility systems were integrated with environmental knowledge to create comprehensive tactical approaches. The ability to move quickly across snow wasn't merely a transportation advantage, but the foundation of combat methods specifically designed to exploit this capability against less mobile adversaries. This integration of technology, knowledge, and tactics created a system greater than the sum of its parts, a reality that Norse expeditions discovered, often fatally, when venturing into northern territories. These mobility advantages translated directly into combat tactics that systematically exploited Norse vulnerabilities while maximising northern strengths. The tactical systems developed by northern forest peoples weren't simply reactions to Norse pressure, but sophisticated approaches refined over generations of conflict in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The signature tactic, mentioned repeatedly in primary sources, was the multi-directional arrow assault. Unlike the mass volley shooting employed in open field battles, northern archers used dispersed positions to launch arrows from multiple angles simultaneously. This approach created a psychological effect far greater than the actual number of arrows might suggest. Norse warriors, unable to form an effective shield wall in forest conditions, found themselves vulnerable from all sides with no clear direction to face or enemy to engage. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Arrowheads recovered from probable conflict sites show distinctive northern designs, optimised for hunting and warfare in forest conditions. Many feature narrow, bodkin-type points, ideal for penetrating multiple layers of winter clothing. The distribution patterns of these finds at several sites suggest attacks from multiple directions rather than from a single battle line. The timing of attacks followed patterns designed to maximise psychological impact and minimise defender effectiveness. Dawn and dusk ambushes were particularly common, exploiting the challenging light conditions of these transition periods. During these times, shadows are longest and most disorienting. Depth perception is compromised, and humans experience natural vigilance dips as their bodies adjust to changing light levels. Northern fighters, intimately familiar with these effects, timed their attacks to exploit these natural vulnerabilities. Night operations represented another tactical domain where northern fighters excelled. Accustomed to the extended darkness of northern winters, they developed techniques for effective night movement and combat that Norse forces struggled to counter. Some accounts describe northern fighters using minimal light sources, small fat lamps or carefully shielded fires, to maintain night vision while creating disorienting glimpses of light for enemies. Archaeological evidence, including specialised fat lamps found at northern sites, supports the technological basis for these capabilities. Water features formed natural ambush locations that northern tactics exploited systematically. River crossings, lake edges, and boggy transitions all created vulnerable moments for travelling parties. Norse accounts describe the terror of being caught halfway across frozen lakes or rivers, with attackers positioned on both banks and the ice itself offering no cover. The tactical principle at work, attacking when the enemy's mobility is most compromised, appears consistently across numerous recorded encounters. The hit-and-run approach represented not a lack of courage, as Norse sources sometimes suggest, but a deliberate strategy that maximised northern advantages. By engaging briefly, inflicting casualties, and withdrawing before Norse forces could organise an effective response, northern fighters systematically degraded enemy capability while minimising their own losses. This approach recognised the reality that northern communities, with smaller populations than Norse societies, could ill afford the casualties of prolonged direct engagements. Deception tactics feature prominently in accounts of northern fighting methods. False trails in snow, decoy movements, and acoustic misdirection all serve to divide Norse parties and lead them into prepared ambush positions. Some sources describe northern fighters deliberately leaving obvious tracks toward hazardous terrain, then using their specialised mobility technology to circle around and attack the now disoriented Norse from behind. Communication systems adapted to forest conditions gave northern fighters significant coordination advantages. Whistles, bird calls, and other acoustic signals that carried effectively through trees allowed widely dispersed fighters to coordinate actions without revealing their positions through visible signals or direct voice communication. Archaeological finds include bone and wooden whistles capable of producing sounds that carry surprisingly well in forest environments while being difficult to localise. The targeting priority system employed in northern tactics reveals sophisticated understanding of group psychology. Rather than simply attacking any available target, northern fighters often focused on leaders, scouts, and individuals carrying essential equipment. This approach maximised the disruptive effect of casualties while creating leadership vacuums at critical moments. Several saga accounts specifically mention northern arrows finding chieftains as if guided by some unseen hand, suggesting either remarkable accuracy or, perhaps more likely, deliberate targeting, based on careful observation of group dynamics. Psychological warfare extended beyond combat to include environmental manipulation. Northern fighters would sometimes allow Norse parties to become disoriented or exhausted before initiating contact, using the environment itself as a weapon to degrade enemy capability. Winter conditions particularly favoured this approach, as cold exposure progressively diminishes cognitive function, fine motor control, and eventually even gross motor skills, effects that northern peoples understood and exploited long before the scientific explanation was known. The no quarter reputation of northern fighters served both practical and psychological purposes. In practical terms, northern communities lacked the resources to manage prisoners, particularly during winter when food supplies were most constrained. Psychologically, the knowledge that surrender was not an option affected Norse morale while ensuring that northern fighters maintained absolute commitment to combat outcomes. This dynamic created fundamentally different stakes for each side in these encounters. Defensive preparations around settlements reveal another dimension of northern tactical thinking. Archaeological evidence shows sophisticated arrangements of obstacles, sightlines, and escape routes integrated into settlement design. Rather than relying on heavy fortifications, which would restrict mobility, northern defenders created systems that channeled attackers into predictable approaches while maintaining multiple withdrawal options for defenders. What emerges from analysis of these tactics is not a haphazard approach, but a coherent system specifically calibrated to northern conditions and Norse vulnerabilities. By systematically negating Norse strengths while amplifying their own advantages, northern fighters created combat dynamics that even experienced Norse warriors struggled to counter effectively. The result was a frontier where Norse military dominance, so evident elsewhere in Europe, reached its practical limits against opponents whose entire way of life had prepared them for exactly this type of conflict. While many encounters between Norse expeditions and northern peoples left little historical trace, several well-documented episodes provide detailed insights into how these conflicts actually unfolded. These accounts, while requiring careful interpretation, reveal patterns that confirm the tactical principles at work and their effectiveness against Norse military approaches. Perhaps the most infamous of these encounters was Tore Hund's expedition to Bjarmland around 1026 CE. According to Snorri Sturluson's account in Heimskringla, Tore, a powerful Norwegian chieftain, led a well-equipped party north along the coast and into the White Sea region. The expedition initially engaged in trade with the Bjarmians, exchanging silver and other goods for furs and other northern commodities. This phase appears to have proceeded peacefully, suggesting established commercial protocols between the groups. The situation deteriorated dramatically when Tore's party violated Bjarmian sacred spaces. The saga describes how the Norse discovered that the Bjarmians buried their dead with valuable goods, including silver and gold. Under cover of darkness, Tore led his men to raid these burial mounds, an act that represented not just theft, but profound spiritual violation from the Bjarmian perspective. The Bjarmian response was swift and overwhelming. According to the saga, the local people pursued Tore's party with howls and screams, forcing the Norse to flee toward their ships. What followed was a fighting retreat through forest and along waterways, with the Bjarmians launching repeated attacks from multiple directions. The saga describes how arrows came flying at them from all sides, confirming the multi-directional assault tactics described earlier. What makes this account particularly valuable is its description of how Tore's party survived when many similar expeditions ended in annihilation. The saga attributes their escape to Tore's possession of a magic reindeer hide garment that protected against northern weapons. While the supernatural protection is unlikely, this detail may reflect Tore's adoption of northern clothing technology, precisely the type of adaptation that could provide a critical advantage in such conditions. The aftermath of this raid is equally instructive. Despite the harrowing escape and casualties suffered, the expedition was considered successful because the plundered goods were so valuable. This economic reality ensured that despite the dangers, Norse leaders would continue organising northern ventures, perpetuating the cycle of incursion and resistance that characterised the northern frontier. Another well-documented encounter appears in the account of Kali and Gunstein's journey north, also described in Heimskringla. This expedition, which included the future King Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, encountered Karelian raiders while travelling along the northern coast. The resulting conflict illustrates how quickly situations could escalate from trade to violence in these frontier regions. According to the saga, the Norse party was initially approached by a great host of Karelians. Rather than immediately attacking, the groups first attempted negotiation, suggesting that even in this frontier zone, violence wasn't always the first resort. When negotiations broke down, however, the resulting combat followed patterns consistent with other accounts of northern tactics. The Karelians are described launching arrows from multiple positions while attempting to surround the Norse party. The Norse response, forming a shield wall with their ships at their backs, represents a classic adaptation of their preferred tactics to the constraints of the situation. This defensive formation allowed them to survive the initial assault, but the saga notes they suffered significant casualties before driving off their attackers. There's late 9th century account to King Alfred provides our most detailed first-person description of peaceful interactions along the northern frontier. As a Norwegian merchant and chieftain from Hålogaland, Other regularly travelled into territories inhabited by Sami peoples to trade and collect tribute. His account describes both the geography of these regions and the nature of Norse-Sami interactions with unusual clarity. Particularly valuable is O, there's description of how tribute was organised. Each pays according to his rank. The highest in rank has to pay 15 marten skins, 5 reindeer skins, 1 bear skin, 10 measures of feathers, a jacket of bear or otter skin, and 2 ship's ropes, each 60 ells long, one made from whale hide and the other from seal hide. This systematic approach suggests established relationships rather than ad hoc raiding, though the power dynamic remained clearly unequal. There also describes how the Sami used different territories seasonally, fishing along the coast in summer while hunting in the interior during winter. This pattern created natural avoidance opportunities when Norse parties approached, as communities could simply move deeper into territories where pursuers would struggle to follow. Archaeological evidence confirms this mobility, with seasonal sites showing periodic occupation patterns over many generations. Less peaceful encounters appear in multiple saga accounts, often following similar patterns. The saga of the people of Vatnsdal describes an expedition to Finnmark, Sami territories, that encountered fierce resistance. The saga notes how the defenders seemed to glide across the snow like spirits, while launching arrows from the forest edge, a clear reference to ski technology and forest ambush tactics. The Norse party in this account suffered heavy casualties before retreating, abandoning their mission entirely. Archaeological evidence provides another window into these encounters. Several sites across northern Scandinavia and northwestern Russia show evidence of violent destruction during the Viking Age, with burned structures and scattered weapon finds suggesting surprise attacks. Particularly telling are arrowhead distributions, which sometimes show patterns consistent with ambush tactics, concentrated around approaches to settlements or natural bottlenecks in the terrain. Burial evidence occasionally reveals direct traces of these conflicts. Several Norse graves from northern regions show injuries consistent with ambush scenarios, arrow wounds to the back or side, rather than the frontal wounds more typical of formation combat. Conversely, some northern burials show evidence of wounds from typical Norse weapons, confirming that these conflicts inflicted casualties on both sides despite the tactical advantages enjoyed by defenders. Place name evidence provides yet another perspective on these encounters. Across northern Scandinavia, locations with names referencing conflict, ambush or death often correspond to natural bottlenecks or challenging terrain features, precisely the locations where northern tactical advantages would be most pronounced. While difficult to date precisely, these toponyms suggest the persistence of conflict memories in local traditions. The cumulative evidence from these various encounters reveals consistent patterns despite their geographic and temporal distribution. Northern fighters repeatedly employed similar tactical approaches because they effectively exploited the same fundamental advantages: mobility, environmental knowledge, and specialised equipment, against Norse parties hampered by the same limitations of unfamiliar terrain and inappropriate equipment. What's particularly striking is how little these tactical dynamics changed over time. Despite centuries of interaction, the basic parameters of northern advantage remained largely constant throughout the Viking Age. This persistence suggests both the effectiveness of northern approaches and the difficulty Norse expeditions faced in developing effective counters to tactics so perfectly adapted to the environment where they operated. These documented encounters, while representing only a fraction of the actual conflicts that occurred along the northern frontier, provide crucial insights into how abstract tactical principles translated into battlefield realities. They confirm that northern resistance wasn't merely sporadic or reactive, but represented a sophisticated defensive system that effectively limited Norse expansion into territories where environmental conditions favoured indigenous approaches to warfare. As we've seen, the northern peoples developed combat systems specifically calibrated to exploit their environmental advantages while neutralising Norse strengths. These weren't primitive or simplistic approaches, but sophisticated tactical adaptations refined through generations of conflict. The effectiveness of these methods depended not just on individual skill, but on specialised equipment, environmental knowledge, and psychological factors that combined to create formidable defensive capabilities. The specialised equipment used by northern fighters represented not just tools, but an integrated technological system perfectly adapted to their environment and tactics. Archaeological finds, ethnographic parallels, and written descriptions allow us to reconstruct the material culture that gave northern warriors their edge in forest combat. The northern bow stands as perhaps the most significant weapon in this arsenal. Unlike the longbows or composite bows used in other regions, northern bows were typically shorter, around 1 to 1.5 metres in length, and made from a single piece of wood, often pine or birch. This design prioritised portability and manoeuvrability in forest conditions over the extreme range possible with longer bows. Archaeological specimens show sophisticated construction, with careful selection of wood from the junction of trunk and branch to utilise natural strength characteristics. Arrow design reveals equally careful adaptation to northern conditions. Arrowheads recovered from archaeological contexts show regional variations, but share common features, optimised for hunting and warfare in forest environments. Many feature narrow, chisel-like points, ideal for penetrating multiple layers of winter clothing. Others show barbed designs that would cause severe tissue damage and be difficult to remove in field conditions. Shafts were typically made from pine, selected for straightness and appropriate weight, with split feather fletching secured with sinew bindings and pine resin. The quiver systems used to carry these arrows reflected practical field considerations. Rather than the rigid containers common in other cultures, northern hunters and warriors often used soft leather quivers that remained silent during movement through brush. Some designs included waterproof covers of birch bark or treated leather to protect arrows from snow and rain, a critical consideration in the humid northern forests. Archaeological evidence suggests these quivers typically carried 20 to 30 arrows, providing substantial combat capability for fighters who might engage multiple times before resupplying. Bladed weapons show similar adaptation to forest conditions. Rather than the longer swords favoured by Norse warriors, northern fighters typically carried shorter cutting and stabbing implements. Knives, short spears, and single-edge cutting tools that could serve multiple purposes. Many combined utilitarian functions with combat capability, allowing fighters to travel with minimal equipment while maintaining effectiveness. The luku, a large, single-edged knife traditional among Sami people, exemplifies this approach, serving as both tool and weapon, with a design optimised for forest use. Protective equipment reflected different priorities than Norse armour systems. Rather than metal armour or heavy shields, northern fighters relied primarily on mobility and concealment for protection. When they did use defensive equipment, it typically took the form of light, flexible protection, hardened leather or multiple layers of hide that minimised movement restrictions. Some archaeological evidence suggests the use of small, highly portable shields designed for deflecting arrows rather than forming shield walls, consistent with the mobile fighting style described in written sources. Clothing represented perhaps the most crucial equipment for northern warfare. The layered approach, typically combining woven wool garments with fur and leather outer layers, provided effective insulation while allowing ventilation during exertion. Sophisticated design features included adjustable closures that could be opened for cooling during movement and sealed for warmth during static periods. Ethnographic parallels suggest garments were often treated with natural water repellents, typically pine tar or animal fats, to maintain insulating properties when wet. Footwear deserves special attention as a critical component of northern combat systems. Archaeological finds reveal sophisticated boot designs with separate inner and outer components. Soft inner boots, often made from reindeer leg skin with the fur turned inward, provided insulation, while tougher outer boots protected against abrasion and moisture. Some designs incorporated fish skin, naturally oil-rich and water-resistant, as a waterproofing layer. The sole construction often featured ridged patterns for improved grip on ice and snow, with some specimens showing attachments specifically designed for compatibility with ski bindings. The ski technology itself represents a remarkable achievement in biomechanical engineering. Archaeological specimens show sophisticated design features, including curved tips of varying angles for different snow conditions, thickened central sections for strength, and binding systems that secured the foot while allowing the heel to lift naturally during stride. Some examples show evidence of animal skin coverings on the base, typically seal or reindeer, arranged to provide grip during ascent but allow smooth gliding on descents and level ground. Carrying systems, how equipment was transported, reveal further adaptation to northern conditions. Rather than the heavy chests or rigid containers used in Norse contexts, northern peoples typically used flexible bags, often made from whole animal skins, with minimal seams to reduce water penetration. These could be easily secured to sleds or carried on the person without restricting movement. Archaeological examples show ingenious closure systems using toggles, drawstrings, and overlapping flaps that could be operated while wearing mittens, a critical consideration in extreme cold. Fire-starting equipment represented another specialised technology crucial for survival in northern conditions. Rather than the striker light systems common in Norse context, which could be challenging to operate with cold-numbed fingers, northern peoples often carried fire in the form of slow-burning fungus, typically tinder fungus, Fomes fomentarius, that could preserve an ember for hours in a protective container. This approach allowed rapid fire starting, even in adverse conditions, a capability with both survival and tactical applications. Illumination technologies adapted to northern requirements included small fat lamps that provided minimal light while preserving night vision. Archaeological examples, typically made from stone with a depression for animal fat and a plant fibre wick, show designs optimised for wind resistance and fuel efficiency. These allowed operation in field conditions with minimal visible signature, useful for both camp activities and tactical movement in darkness. Navigation tools, while leaving less obvious archaeological traces, likely included sophisticated methods for orientation in featureless winter landscapes. Ethnographic parallels suggest the use of natural indicators like prevailing wind-shaped trees, star patterns, and snow formation characteristics to maintain direction even in poor visibility. Some archaeological sites show what appear to be trail markers, stone cairns or modified trees positioned to be visible in winter conditions, suggesting systematic approaches to territorial navigation. What emerges from this material evidence is not a collection of individual items, but an integrated technological system. Each element complemented the others, creating capabilities greater than the sum of their parts. The northern equipment paradigm prioritised different values than Norse material culture, favouring adaptability over specialisation, portability over durability, and system integration over individual item performance. This approach created a material foundation perfectly aligned with the tactical systems it supported, enabling northern fighters to maintain their advantages even against numerically superior and better resourced opponents. In the harsh northern environment, wounds and exposure represented threats often more deadly than enemy weapons. The interaction between combat injuries and extreme cold created unique challenges that shaped tactical decisions and survival outcomes for both sides in these frontier conflicts. Cold-related injuries occurred along a spectrum of severity, with hypothermia representing the most immediate threat to combat effectiveness. Even mild hypothermia, body temperature dropping to around 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, significantly impairs cognitive function, judgment, and fine motor control. These effects would be particularly devastating for Norse fighters already struggling with unfamiliar terrain and tactical situations. Archaeological evidence from some northern sites suggests deliberate tactical use of this vulnerability, with ambush locations positioned to force enemies into water crossings, or exposed areas where wind and wetness would accelerate heat loss. Frostbite presented another serious threat, particularly to extremities. In temperatures below -15 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, common during northern winters, exposed skin can freeze in minutes. Norse clothing, while generally well adapted for Scandinavian conditions, often lacked the specific features needed for extreme cold. Mittens, for example, preserve heat more effectively than gloves by keeping fingers together, but make weapon handling more difficult. Northern fighters with equipment designed for these conditions could maintain combat effectiveness longer in extreme cold, creating a widening capability gap as exposure time increased. Wet, cold conditions created perhaps the most dangerous scenarios. Water conducts heat away from the body approximately 25 times faster than air at the same temperature. Norse accounts describe the terror of falling through ice, or being forced to wade through streams during winter combat, experiences that could reduce even strong warriors to helplessness within minutes. Northern tactics frequently exploited this vulnerability by positioning ambushes near water crossings or deliberately damaging ice to create hazards for pursuers. The treatment of combat wounds under field conditions reveals sophisticated northern approaches to wilderness medicine. Ethnographic parallels and limited archaeological evidence suggest the use of moss, particularly sphagnum, as an antiseptic wound dressing, an effective practice now understood to result from the plant's natural antibacterial properties. Birch bark contains compounds, notably betulin, with anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial effects, and evidence suggests its use in treating wounds and skin conditions during winter campaigns. Temperature management of injuries presented unique challenges in extreme cold. Wounds that would be survivable in milder conditions could prove fatal when combined with cold exposure. The body's natural response to significant injury, directing blood flow away from extremities to protect core functions, compounds the already elevated risk of peripheral cold injury. Northern fighters, with better insulation and environmental knowledge, could better manage this dangerous interaction between trauma and temperature. The psychology of cold injury significantly impacted combat dynamics. The fear of freezing, often more immediate than the fear of enemy weapons, could drive decisions that worsened tactical situations. Norse accounts describe parties abandoning defensive positions to seek warmth, or taking dangerous routes to avoid exposure, creating vulnerabilities that northern defenders readily exploited. This psychological dimension added another advantage for fighters accustomed to operating in extreme conditions and confident in their cold weather systems. Dehydration, counterintuitively, represented a serious threat even in snow-covered environments. Cold air holds less moisture, increasing respiratory water loss, while the exertion of moving through snow dramatically increases water requirements. Melting snow for drinking requires fuel and time, resources often scarce during combat operations. Northern fighters, with established techniques for efficient water access and knowledge of natural sources like springs that remain unfrozen even in deep winter, maintained better hydration and consequently better physical and cognitive function during extended operations. Nutrition strategies adapted to cold conditions represented another domain where northern knowledge provided advantages. The high caloric requirements of cold weather activity, sometimes exceeding 5,000 calories daily during intensive movement, necessitated specialised approaches to field feeding. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests northern fighters carried concentrated, high-fat foods that provided maximum energy with minimum weight and preparation requirements. This nutritional advantage became increasingly significant during extended operations, as Norse parties often exhausted their supplies while struggling to hunt or forage in unfamiliar territory. Sleep management in extreme conditions further differentiated the combatants. The ability to rest effectively while maintaining safety from both enemies and environmental threats required specialised knowledge and equipment. Northern fighters utilised techniques for creating effective emergency shelters from available materials, snow caves, lean-tos or windbreaks that could be rapidly constructed and provide sufficient protection for recovery. Norse parties, lacking this knowledge, often suffered from sleep deprivation that progressively degraded their combat effectiveness during extended operations. The cumulative effect of these environmental factors created a capability gap that widened over time. During initial contact, Norse parties might maintain combat effectiveness comparable to their northern opponents. As hours stretched into days, however, the combined effects of cold exposure, inadequate rest, dehydration, and untreated minor injuries progressively degraded their capabilities. This deterioration curve explains why many Norse expeditions that began confidently ended in disaster. The environmental attrition eventually rendered even experienced warriors vulnerable to opponents better adapted to these conditions. Perhaps most significantly, the northern approach to these environmental challenges wasn't merely about individual survival techniques, but represented an integrated system of knowledge, equipment, and practices developed over countless generations. This systematic approach allowed northern fighters to operate effectively in conditions that their opponents experienced as hostile and threatening, transforming the environment itself from a neutral backdrop into an active ally in their defensive strategy. Understanding this dimension of northern conflict helps explain why relatively small groups could effectively resist much larger and better equipped Norse forces. The combination of environmental stress and combat pressure created compound challenges that even experienced warriors struggled to overcome when operating outside their familiar contexts. In the northern forests, survival knowledge wasn't separate from combat capability. It was its essential foundation. Despite the significant challenges of northern operations, Norse leaders continued organising expeditions into these territories throughout the Viking Age and beyond. This persistence drove adaptations in equipment, tactics and approaches as Norse parties learned, often through harsh experience, how to counter some of the advantages enjoyed by northern defenders. The most obvious adaptations appeared in material culture, as Norse expeditions increasingly incorporated elements of northern equipment. Archaeological evidence from later Viking Age contexts shows hybrid designs combining Norse construction techniques with northern functional features. Footwear provides clear examples, with some Norse specimens showing adaptations clearly inspired by northern designs, separate inner and outer components, improved insulation, and sole patterns better suited to snow and ice. These adaptations suggest practical learning through experience rather than mere cultural borrowing. Ski technology represents another domain where Norse adaptation is evident. While skiing originated among northern forest peoples, Norse communities gradually adopted and modified this technology for their own use. Later Viking Age and medieval sources increasingly mention Norse use of skis for both transportation and warfare. The saga of Haakon the Good describes how King Haakon, the first of Norway, escaped from enemies by having his men carry him on skis, suggesting both the adoption of the technology and recognition of its tactical value. Clothing systems show similar patterns of adaptation. Later Norse winter garments increasingly featured elements clearly derived from northern designs, layered construction, adjustable closures, and fur arrangements optimised for Arctic conditions. Particularly telling are hybrid garments that maintain Norse aesthetic elements while incorporating functional features developed by northern peoples. These adaptations reflect pragmatic recognition of superior design rather than arbitrary cultural borrowing. Tactical adaptations accompanied these material changes. Norse expeditions increasingly abandoned large party approaches in favour of smaller, more mobile groups better suited to forest operations. This shift appears in both archaeological evidence, smaller, more dispersed camps rather than large concentrated sites, and written sources that describe changing composition of northern ventures. By reducing party size, Norse leaders sacrificed raw combat power but gained mobility and sustainability, creating more balanced capabilities for northern operations. Timing adaptations reflect growing Norse understanding of seasonal factors. Early expeditions often operated on schedules better suited to more temperate regions, placing them in northern territories during the most challenging conditions. Later ventures show more sophisticated timing, with deliberate alignment to seasonal windows that minimised environmental challenges while still accomplishing mission objectives. This adaptation required improved understanding of northern seasonal patterns and their operational implications. political adaptations proved perhaps most significant for long-term Norse operations in the north. Rather than relying solely on direct force, Norse leaders increasingly developed alliance relationships with some northern groups against others. This approach leveraged existing tensions between different northern peoples to create opportunities for Norse influence without the costs and risks of direct confrontation. Archaeological evidence of trade goods at northern sites suggests these relationships often included material exchanges that benefited both parties. The use of cultural intermediaries, individuals who could operate effectively in both Norse and northern contexts, became increasingly common in later periods. These figures, sometimes of mixed parentage, or individuals who had lived among both cultures, facilitated communication and negotiation that reduced unnecessary conflict. Several saga accounts mention such intermediaries, describing their crucial role in preventing misunderstandings that might otherwise escalate to violence. Settlement patterns reveal another dimension of Norse adaptation. Rather than attempting to replicate southern Scandinavian agricultural practices in unsuitable northern environments, Norse settlers in frontier regions increasingly adopted subsistence strategies more similar to those of northern peoples, emphasizing hunting, fishing, and limited pastoralism rather than crop agriculture. This ecological adaptation created a more sustainable presence in northern regions while reducing conflict over land use. Religious adaptations appear in several dimensions of Norse-northern interactions. While early encounters often involved Norse violation of northern sacred sites, as in Tore Hund's raid on Bjarmian burial grounds, later interactions show more careful navigation of religious boundaries. Some evidence suggests Norse adoption of protective practices believed effective against northern magic, likely representing practical adaptations reinterpreted through supernatural frameworks. Language acquisition represents a subtle but important adaptation evident in later sources. Norse accounts increasingly include northern terminology for environmental features, equipment, and techniques. Words adopted because they describe concepts for which Old Norse lacked precise equivalents. This linguistic borrowing facilitated more effective operation in northern contexts, while enabling transmission of specialized knowledge between cultures. The cumulative effect of these adaptations was not to eliminate the advantages enjoyed by northern defenders, but to reduce the capability gap enough to make certain types of Norse operations viable. Tribute collection, trade, and limited resource extraction became more sustainable, though northern peoples maintained effective resistance against more exploitative approaches. This dynamic equilibrium characterized the northern frontier through the end of the Viking Age and into the medieval period. What's particularly notable about these adaptations is their pragmatic character. Rather than rejecting northern approaches as primitive or beneath them, Norse operators in these regions showed remarkable willingness to adopt techniques that worked, regardless of their origin. This practical flexibility, adapting foreign methods while maintaining their own cultural identity, characterizes much of Norse expansion more broadly, but appears especially pronounced in northern operations where environmental challenges made such adaptation essential for survival. These Norse adaptations, while significant, never completely erased the advantages enjoyed by indigenous northern peoples in their home territories. Instead, they created a more complex frontier dynamic where advantage shifted according to specific conditions, party composition, and operational objectives, a fluid situation that would characterize these northern borderlands for centuries to come. The long-term historical trajectories of the peoples who resisted Norse expansion diverged significantly. While the Sami maintained cultural continuity into the present day, the more enigmatic Bjarmians gradually disappeared from historical records, raising questions about their ultimate fate and relationship to later populations of northern Russia. The Bjarmians, Bjormus in some sources, appear prominently in Viking Age accounts, particularly in connection with the White Sea region and the northern Divina River basin. Archaeological evidence from this period shows settlements with distinctive material culture, combining elements of Finno-Ugric tradition with influences from both Scandinavian and more Eastern sources. Trade goods at these sites, including Arabic coins, Baltic amber, and Scandinavian metalwork, confirm their integration into long-distance exchange networks described in written sources. By the late medieval period, however, specific references to Bjarmians as a distinct people became increasingly rare in historical records. This disappearance doesn't necessarily indicate population extinction, but more likely reflects changing terminology as new political entities emerged in the region. Many scholars associate the Bjarmians with Permian peoples who later became known by other names, including ancestors of modern Komi and related groups. This interpretation suggests cultural transformation and incorporation rather than disappearance. Several factors likely contributed to this transformation. The rise of Novgorod as a regional power from the 11th century onward brought more systematic Russian influence into former Bjarmian territories. Archaeological evidence shows changing material culture during this period, with increasing Eastern Orthodox elements appearing alongside traditional features. This process likely included both cultural adoption and population movement, creating more complex ethnographic patterns. Changing trade patterns also impacted Bjarmian communities. As the medieval economic system evolved, the direct Norse-Bjarmian exchanges described in earlier sources gave way to more complex networks dominated by Novgorod and other emerging powers. Communities previously oriented toward the White Sea increasingly connected to river systems flowing south and east, altering their economic and cultural orientation. Archaeological evidence of this transition appears in changing distribution patterns of trade goods and shifting settlement locations. Religious changes accompanied these political and economic transformations. The gradual Christianization of the region, primarily Eastern Orthodox Christianity, spreading from Novgorod, altered spiritual practices previously described in Norse sources. Some evidence suggests syncretic practices combining Christian elements with traditional beliefs persisted in remote areas, but the distinct religious system that so impressed Norse observers progressively transformed under these influences. The Sami historical trajectory presents a striking contrast of cultural continuity despite significant external pressures. Throughout the medieval period and into modern times, Sami communities maintain distinctive cultural practices, language and identity while adapting to changing political and economic contexts. This continuity doesn't represent isolation or lack of change, but rather successful adaptation that preserved core cultural elements while engaging with surrounding societies. Archaeological evidence reveals this adaptive continuity across centuries. Sami material culture shows both persistence of traditional elements and selective incorporation of external influences according to local needs and values. Settlement patterns demonstrate continuing mobility adapted to environmental conditions, with seasonal movement between resource areas remaining a feature of many Sami communities into recent centuries. Political pressures on Sami territories intensified during the medieval and early modern periods. The consolidating kingdoms of Norway, Sweden and Russia increasingly asserted claims over northern regions, often overlapping in ways that created complex jurisdictional situations. Sami communities navigated these pressures through various strategies, sometimes paying tribute to multiple powers, other times relocating to less contested areas, or negotiating specific rights and protections within emerging state structures. Religious pressure accompanied political expansion, with Christian missionary efforts targeting Sami communities from multiple directions: Lutheran from Sweden, Catholic and later Lutheran from Norway, and Orthodox from Russia. Traditional Sami spiritual practices, centered around the Noaidi, shamanic practitioners, and sacred sites, Siadi, faced increasing suppression. Despite these pressures, elements of traditional belief systems persisted, sometimes incorporated into nominally Christian practices or maintained in private contexts. Economic integration transformed but didn't eliminate distinctive Sami lifeways. The growth of market involvement, particularly through the fur trade and later reindeer products, created new economic relationships while building on traditional skills and knowledge. Archaeological and historical evidence shows Sami communities actively engaging with these opportunities while maintaining subsistence practices that preserved their autonomy from complete market dependence. Language persistence represents one of the most remarkable aspects of Sami continuity. Despite centuries of assimilationist pressure, the Sami languages, a branch of the Finno-Ugric family with several distinct varieties, continue as living languages today. This linguistic continuity provided a crucial vehicle for cultural transmission across generations, preserving knowledge systems, oral traditions, and worldviews that might otherwise have been lost. The technological systems that proved so effective against Norse expansion continued to evolve rather than disappear. Ski designs, clothing systems, and environmental knowledge adapted to changing conditions and requirements while maintaining their core functionality. Some elements were adopted by surrounding populations, creating the paradoxical situation where technologies developed for resistance became widely associated with the very nations that had once been resisted. The colonial period brought intensified pressures on Sami communities, with state policies often explicitly aimed at assimilation or marginalisation. Despite these challenges, Sami cultural identity persisted, eventually forming the basis for modern indigenous rights movements that have achieved significant recognition in recent decades. This contemporary resurgence represents not a recreation of lost traditions, but the continuing evolution of a cultural identity that never disappeared. Comparing these divergent trajectories, Bjarmian transformation versus Sami continuity, reveals different responses to similar pressures. Geographic factors likely played a role, with Bjarmian territories more directly in the path of Russian expansion, while some Sami regions remained relatively remote, even into modern times. Economic specialisation may have also contributed, with reindeer pastoralism providing a distinctive ecological niche less immediately threatened by agricultural expansion. What both cases demonstrate is the inadequacy of simplistic, vanished peoples narratives that once dominated historical treatments of northern indigenous groups. The archaeological and historical evidence reveals not disappearance, but transformation, adaptation, and in the Sami case, remarkable continuity despite enormous pressure. Understanding these complex trajectories provides essential context for interpreting the earlier resistance to Norse expansion, showing how the strategies and systems developed during that period continued to shape northern history long after the Viking Age ended. One of the most distinctive features of northern warfare was the practice, noted with horror in Norse sources, of giving no quarter to defeated enemies. This approach wasn't simply about brutality, but reflected practical realities and cultural understandings that made prisoner-taking problematic in northern contexts. The logistics of managing prisoners presented perhaps the most immediate practical obstacle. Northern communities typically operated with limited food reserves, carefully calculated to sustain their own population through the challenging winter months. Additional mouths to feed, particularly unproductive prisoners, could threaten the entire community's survival until the next hunting or fishing season. Unlike agricultural societies with storable grain surpluses, the hunting and gathering economies of many northern groups simply lacked the excess capacity to maintain captives. Transportation challenges compounded these resource limitations. Moving prisoners through deep snow or dense forest required equipment, supervision, and energy that small raiding parties could rarely spare. A captured Norse warrior, unfamiliar with ski or snowshoe use, would move at a fraction of his captor's speed, dramatically slowing their withdrawal and extending their exposure to potential counterattack. This mobility differential made prisoner transport impractical in many tactical situations. Security considerations further discouraged prisoner taking. Northern fighting groups, typically smaller than their Norse opponents, couldn't easily spare warriors for guard duty. Even a few captives would require disproportionate security resources, degrading the group's combat effectiveness and creating vulnerabilities that could prove fatal in subsequent encounters. This unfavourable security equation made releasing prisoners dangerous while keeping them impractical. The absence of ransom systems in many northern societies removed another incentive for prisoner taking. Norse and other European cultures had developed elaborate conventions around captive ransoming, with established procedures and price structures based on social status. These systems provided economic motivation for keeping high-status prisoners alive. In northern contexts and where such conventions hadn't developed or operated differently, this economic incentive was largely absent. Cultural understandings of conflict differed significantly between Norse and northern societies. Many northern groups conceptualized warfare not as a path to dominance or tribute, but as a response to specific violations requiring definitive resolution. From this perspective, allowing enemy survivors could represent an incomplete addressing of the original violation, potentially requiring future action. This cultural framework prioritized conclusive outcomes over temporary advantage. Environmental factors reinforced these tendencies toward decisive combat resolution. In the harsh northern environment, wounded individuals left behind faced almost certain death from exposure, predators, or starvation. What might appear as mercy in leaving wounded enemies alive could actually condemn them to slower, more painful deaths than immediate killing would entail. This environmental reality created a binary survival situation that discouraged middle ground approaches common in more temperate regions. The seasonal constraints of northern operations further shaped these practices. With limited operational windows between periods of impassable conditions, conflicts needed resolution within compressed timeframes. The luxury of extended sieges, prisoner negotiations, or gradual attrition rarely existed in northern warfare, pushing toward more immediate and definitive combat outcomes. Norse sources sometimes characterise these no-quarter practices as evidence of northern savagery, but this interpretation reflects cultural bias rather than objective assessment. From the northern perspective, these approaches represented rational adaptation to environmental and social realities. The same Norse who condemned northern practices often engaged in equally deadly behaviour in other contexts, particularly during raids on undefended communities elsewhere in Europe. Archaeological evidence provides some corroboration for these written accounts. Some conflict sites show evidence of complete killing rather than selective violence, with wound patterns suggesting systematic elimination of opponents rather than the mixture of fatal and non-fatal injuries more typical of conventional battles. These findings align with written descriptions of no-quarter practices while providing physical evidence independent of potentially biased textual sources. This aspect of northern warfare had significant psychological implications for both sides. For Norse warriors accustomed to the possibility of surrender, ransom, or enslavement if defeated, the prospect of certain death likely created additional stress during northern operations. Conversely, northern fighters operated with the knowledge that defeat meant annihilation, potentially strengthening their resolve in desperate situations. This psychological asymmetry created another advantage for defenders beyond purely tactical considerations. Understanding these no-quarter practices in their proper context helps explain both their development and persistence. Far from representing arbitrary cruelty, they reflected rational adaptation to the environmental, economic and cultural realities of northern conflict. This pattern demonstrates once again how northern warfare wasn't simply a primitive version of Norse approaches, but a sophisticated system specifically calibrated to the unique conditions where it developed and operated. The forest fighters of the far north developed one of history's most effective systems of asymmetric warfare, creating tactical approaches that neutralized the advantages of militarily superior opponents. Their success offers insights that transcend their specific historical context, illuminating broader principles of adaptation environmental mastery, and resistance. Perhaps the most fundamental principle demonstrated by Northern resistance was the power of environmental adaptation. Rather than attempting to match Norse military strength directly, Northern fighters developed approaches that transformed their challenging environment from a survival obstacle into a tactical asset. This environmental leverage allowed numerically inferior forces to effectively counter larger, better-equipped opponents by systematically exploiting terrain features, seasonal conditions, and mobility differentials that favoured defenders. The integration of technology, tactics, and environmental knowledge created capabilities greater than the sum of their parts. Northern ski technology wasn't merely a transportation method, but the foundation of a comprehensive mobility system that enabled specific tactical approaches. Similarly, clothing wasn't just protection from cold, but an essential component of operational capability that extended mission duration and preserved combat effectiveness in extreme conditions. This system's thinking, where each element reinforced others, multiplied the effectiveness of individual components. The psychological dimension of Northern tactics reveals sophisticated understanding of human factors in combat. By creating conditions of disorientation, isolation, and environmental threat, Northern fighters generated psychological pressure that degraded enemy decision-making and morale independent of physical casualties inflicted. This cognitive approach to warfare, targeting the mind as much as the body, allowed relatively small forces to have disproportionate impact against larger opponents. The Northern example also demonstrates how indigenous knowledge systems, often dismissed as primitive by outside observers, can contain sophisticated understanding, developed through generations of environmental interaction. What Norse sources described as magic typically represented practical skills and knowledge beyond their observers' experience, from predicting weather changes to tracking game across seemingly featureless terrain. This pattern of misinterpreting unfamiliar knowledge as supernatural appears consistently across cultural contact situations worldwide. The economic dimension of this frontier conflict highlights how resource competition drives historical interactions. The extraordinary value of northern commodities, particularly furs and ivory, created powerful incentives for Norse expansion despite known dangers. This economic reality ensured continued pressure on northern territories regardless of individual expeditions' outcomes, creating conditions for sustained resistance rather than single decisive encounters. The long-term trajectories of northern peoples demonstrate different possible outcomes of indigenous resistance. The Sami example shows how cultural continuity could persist despite centuries of pressure, with adaptive strategies that preserved core identity while engaging with changing circumstances. The Bjarmian case illustrates more transformative outcomes, where distinct identity gradually merged into new configurations through combinations of adoption, adaptation, and incorporation into emerging political structures. From a military history perspective, the Northern resistance offers a compelling case study in asymmetric warfare. The tactical systems developed by Northern fighters anticipate principles rediscovered in many later conflicts, from mobility advantages and environmental leverage to psychological operations and targeted leadership elimination. Their success against one of history's most formidable military cultures demonstrates how well-adapted defensive systems can effectively counter even significant technological and numerical advantages. For modern indigenous rights discussions, this historical example provides important context about the sophisticated systems developed by northern peoples and their effective resistance to external pressure. Rather than passive victims of history, these communities actively shaped their circumstances through innovation, adaptation, and strategic action, a historical agency often overlooked in simplified narratives of indigenous colonial interactions. Perhaps most importantly, this forgotten chapter of resistance reminds us that history's dominant narratives often obscure crucial perspectives. The Viking expansion that appears triumphant in many historical accounts actually reached definitive limits against northern resistance. a reality rarely centred in popular understanding of the period. By recovering these counter-narratives, we develop a more complete and nuanced understanding of historical processes that shape the world we inhabit today. The tactical systems developed by the forest peoples of the far north represent one of history's most effective examples of asymmetric warfare, a sophisticated approach that combined environmental mastery, specialised technology, and psychological operations to counter a militarily superior opponent. Their success against Norse expansion demonstrates principles that transcend their specific historical context, offering insights into resistance, adaptation, and survival that remain relevant today. What would your preferred approach be if you found yourself in these northern forests facing Viking raiders? Would you choose skis for their superior speed and range, allowing rapid strikes followed by quick withdrawal beyond pursuing range? Or would snowshoes be your preference, offering better stability in dense forest and more practical fighting platforms when engagement couldn't be avoided? Perhaps you'd opt for boat-based night operations, using darkness and water approaches to neutralise Norse advantages while creating maximum disorientation. Each approach offered distinct advantages and limitations. Ski-based tactics provided unmatched mobility across open terrain but required more skill and offered less stability during direct combat. Snowshoe operations sacrificed some speed for improved manoeuvrability in dense forest and better fighting platforms. Boat-based night approaches leveraged darkness and waterways, but required specialised knowledge of ice conditions and water navigation in challenging environments. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these tactical approaches and which you find most compelling. Would you combine elements of different methods? Do you see parallels with other historical resistance movements that employed similar principles? Your insights add valuable perspectives to our understanding of these historical dynamics. If you found this exploration of northern resistance compelling, you might enjoy other content in our Viking history and culture playlist. From shipbuilding technology to religious transformations, these videos examine different aspects of the Norse world and its interactions with surrounding cultures. Each offers the same evidence-based approach to understanding these complex historical processes. What other historical topics would you like to see explored in future videos? Perhaps the specialised trading systems that connected northern resources to global markets, or the technological adaptations that allowed survival in some of Earth's most challenging environments? Your suggestions help shape our content development and ensure we're addressing questions that matter to our community of history enthusiasts. And thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most fascinating frontier zones, where the limits of Norse expansion met effective indigenous resistance, creating a dynamic that would shape northern Eurasia for centuries to come. By recovering these forgotten chapters of resistance, we develop a more complete understanding of historical processes that continue to influence our world today.